That's what we used to say in class, way back when I was in, uh, God, almost 50 years ago, teaching middle school and then high school for a little while. If anybody, we had a rule: if anybody brought any food to eat in class, they had to bring enough for everyone. And
Here.
it was better. It was better than saying, nobody can bring any food of any sort to class. They could make a choice. And so we were all about teaching kids to make choices, and that with responsibilities, came trade-offs. Sometimes you had to fess up and do things. So anyhow, um, lots of things have changed since then, obviously. The I'm trying to kind of stay out of the mix any more than I need to, kind of in class, because I think the strength of a class like this is the interaction between you, and hopefully you had some opportunity to do that with the teams in the last couple of weeks or so. I understand there were some uh, technical issues in terms of getting the teams together. I don't know, trying to figure out why that occurred, but it should have worked perfectly, but it did not. So we'll see what we can do to kind of improve that process a little bit.
So we can make that a part of the criteria.
Yeah.
But if you get an overwhelming response, you need to do that and do it as a focus group, and we'll just go into that way.
Okay. All right. These things are kind of new and different in terms of trying to incorporate all the technology and at the same time get the kind of interaction you'd like to get. It's kind of interesting. I've been engaged in a couple of research studies, or with ongoing research we have going out, but looking at the level of community and interaction that can be developed in a virtual spacing and virtual instruction. And it's kind of funny because in virtual space, a class, kind of like this, using some platform like this, there's actually tends to be a better or bigger sense of community than there is in a traditional quote unquote seated classroom. Now that's based on some instruments, a couple of instruments that have been around for an awfully long time and have always been used to kind of identify the kind of the sense of community in a classroom setting or in a learning setting. And so it's kind of interesting to us, and we published a couple of articles in the book chapter on that already, and we're kind of keep extending it and keep trying to get a better sense of what's going on. And now we're in that point where we're kind of digging down to see if we can begin to make some sense out of it. And so I had hoped that this using the separate Zoom rooms and things like that would have worked a little bit better, but it I did it exactly as the folks over at the help desk told me to do it, and evidently they didn't quite get that right either. So we're going back and forth a little bit, and now we'll fix that thing. We'll get it so it works a little bit better. But I've noticed that I do have final papers for that first structural analysis piece beginning to come in. I haven't looked to see if they're all from the same group or two. I think a couple of groups found a way to interact, and maybe a couple of groups didn't quite get there. But we will, as I said, we will figure out what we can do there to kind of move that process along. We're going to be shifting some dates forward just a little bit in terms of the other assignment dates a little bit. By forward, I mean forward into the year and not forward closer to the time. And so we're gonna be pushing, I guess pushing them back would be a better way to say it. Some dates. I haven't quite finalized all of those things yet to put it on the schedule sheet, but I will do that tomorrow. So you can, after this paper, and I'll probably extend a couple of days out on that, you know, in terms of getting that paper in, even though you didn't get your group feedback from your group. You know, I assume that most of you had done a draft of that anyhow. And so we will kind of look at that and take that into account. So we'll push that one back a couple of days because I think some folks might need a couple more days to get that done. The next thing, which is the reason we have to get the group thing working better, is because the next assignment is a group project and not an individual project informed by group discussion. And so we have to make sure we get that piece working, you know, just right, so that you can, you know, work as groups. I think a lot of it had to do with timing on those Zoom sessions. You know, there was the settings that I put on those, which was to allow anybody to join and start it at any time, that I didn't have to be in the group or didn't have to have the room open for you to be able to do that. As it turned out, that didn't work as planned. And so, you know, the folks at over at the help desk are trying to figure out why that didn't work as planned. And my college IT liaison is trying to figure out why that didn't work as planned. And so we should have that figured out in the next couple of days, and then be able to make that work a little bit better. So we're going to back that off by about a week in terms of the due date of us, to give it, you know, a bit more time to kind of come to that. And then we'll kind of see where we go from there. I mean, I think that probably that might be the only thing we need to do there, because the final project date is going to be backed off until, you know, kind of near the end of the course anyhow. So we'll, you know, we'll be in pretty good shape, I think, with most of that. Yeah. Sometimes when, you know, things don't work, you just put up your hands and try to fix it. And so we'll see what happens. That's kind of the thing I learned a long time ago, is that you don't worry about what didn't work. You just try to figure out how to make it work better, or make it work, period. And then we can kind of move forward from there. So with that in mind, I don't tend to pontificate too much tonight. I want to kind of see where your thoughts are in terms of your first paper. I mean, obviously I'll kind of wait to, you know, I'll kind of wait till next week to kind of summarize all that, because once I've read all your papers, and I can kind of react back to them. By the way, there are no wrong or right answers there. It's just, you know, have you analyzed the setting that you looked at, and, you know, have you kind of put the filter on it to, and so my feedback to you will probably be just more prompting questions. You know, did you think about this, or how did they do this, or how did they do it? You know, that sort of feedback. It won't be that, you know, you got this all wrong, so start from scratch, nothing like that. But so it is to provide some, you know, another set of eyes that, yeah, might see something, or might prompt a question that you didn't really consider, or something like that. And so that's the nature of the feedback that you'll get on those things. And you know, the 3 or 4 that I've already got up there, I kind of glanced through those quickly this afternoon. I didn't have a chance really to, you know, do a full read with them, but I glanced through them, and I thought they were all, you know, coming in pretty good shape, and kind of looked like, you know, you had thought through that process, and it was consistent with the material, the reading material, and things like that. So I felt pretty good about that. So we'll hope that moves forward. You know, one of the kind of abiding issues in how we organize higher education is this constant tension between structure and creativity. and you know, you would like the organization to be structured enough that you kind of know where your dollars are going, and you know where the resources need to be, and you know who's doing what and who's responsible for what, and you know all those things that administrators, you know, have to worry about. And at the same time, you want to create enough autonomy and freedom, and so that different parts of the organization can be creative, can look for creative solutions and look for creative ways to approach things, and you know, kind of stay on the cusp of the next thing. You know, the one of my roles years ago when I was a director of institutional research was to try to anticipate, you know, job demands and uh, you know, kind of student demand, and you know where we needed to be going and where we needed to be laying the groundwork to move in what direction, and you know, as using that as a kind of a document to help think in terms of strategic planning. Because in higher ed institutions, you really need to revisit a strategic plan every couple of 3 years anyhow. Some institutions do it every year, but you know, they update the strategic plan every year. But most institutions at least begin to look at it in depth at least every 2 to 3 years, so that you don't have, you know, you don't get caught off guard. You don't get suddenly the, you know, the changes that occur today, and particularly in, you know, technologies and things like that, occur so rapidly and are so you know, ground shaking, that if you're not set up to anticipate and to adapt and to move with you know, some agility, uh, you just get left out of the mix. You don't get a seat at the table to do some of those things. And so it is a, you know, there is this tension between structure and you know, creativity and freedom, and how do you create an organization that has, you know, maximum amounts of both of those things, but in a way that they don't cancel each other out. You know, we've all are victims of the annual plan. You know, we have the annual plan, and we have to write our response to the annual plan at the end of the year. And I'm writing my self-study for last year right now, because for some reason the university decided to go on a calendar year as opposed to an academic year, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But anyhow, we're on a calendar year, so I'm trying to figure out what I did a year ago. And you know, if you don't, I'm not one of those folks that writes it down every day. This is what I did today. And so you know, I go along and kind of go back through calendars and stuff, like, oh yeah, I did meet with those guys. Oh yeah, I did write that. Oh yeah, I did. And so you know, you kind of use an exorbitant amount of time just trying to remember what you did last year. Uh, and so yeah, it's kind of it's a it's crazy stuff, but it is that structured cycle that we want to respond to. So how did you find looking at the structural elements of the institution that you chose to take a look at? How did you find that? Did you find that to be fairly easy, a little more difficult? Did you find incongruencies and inconsistencies within the organization where, you know, perhaps one element of the structure leaned in a certain direction and maybe other elements didn't support that? Or, I mean, how did you find that? This is an exercise in metacognition after the fact, which is kind of absurd, but yeah.
I'll chime in.
Okay.
So it was an metacognition. It was an activity of metacognition because it was kind of hard for me to analyze things that are going on in my institution that I have not even thought of about analyzing. But once I did, it came with ease because I could see those tensions that we take for granted, or it's an everyday interaction. I could see them coming at play. I'm like, oh, okay, so this is why, this is happening.
That's the key word. That's the key word, the why word. That's eventually, as you get near the end of this course and get kind of toward that final project, you'll see even in a bigger sense why that why word is so important. Come on, folks, take a chance.
Well, throughout the process, I found there was a lot that I didn't know because it's so intricate and so many pieces playing into it. So when you would think you would start to figure out one path and how things were related, then something else would kind of pop in, or a different point of view. So it's not really clean is what I found.
Yeah, it tends to be very compartmentalized, and from an individual perspective, you see those elements that interact with you on a daily basis or on a weekly basis or whatever, and you kind of don't, you need to, in thinking about dealing with administration or higher ed administration, you have to kind of see how all those elements begin to, fit together or not fit together, and kind of get at, you can kind of see why some of those, you can kind of see why some of those decisions that seem to come just out of the blue do. They're not coming just out of the blue. They're coming because they're fixing a problem that's, maybe only apparent when you look at it from 10,000 feet.
I added in the use of FERPA because it makes it so we can't talk to like all the parents and everything, but also within each division, financial aid and registrar and admissions, we don't have the same screens so that we protect the students' privacy. Not exactly FERPA in that sense, but if we can't edit other screens, we can't register someone for something and then give them more financial aid or something. So, and yet the massive system that we have to use can be kind of clunky because so many people use it, but it has to serve everyone on campus, like the business office as well.
And think about the student's perspective. Why am I going to, 3 or 4 different people to, to get registered, to get, admitted, registered, paid, whatever? Why do I have to go to 3 or 4 offices and get 3 or 4 separate form signatures in order to do something that seems, very simple? Is there a way to do that as a one-stop shop? And so, from the perspective of the client, the student, things that make perfect sense to the organization may not make any sense at all to the client, and vice versa. And so you're kind of, they're kind of wafting around in the breeze that's created by that tension, and you can see some frustration why that occurs sometimes.
That's what I stated. I wrote about because as a student, you don't know what's going on. And I don't work in higher ed yet, so I don't know what's going on. But there's so many processes, procedures, there's so much going on that you don't even know, that the student's unaware of. So unless you're, work study or hired in to work, then you're not going to know how they operate and how each department, and every department operates separately under a big, structured.
Yeah, it's that kind of, that term that was in the literature there, loose coupling.
Yes, I'm writing about that. Is anybody else writing about that? Oh, Julie, okay, pick your brain.
But it is, that notion of loose coupling is a term that is an awkward sort of term, but it does seem to fit in some ways the nature of organizations, the way these higher ed organizations seem to function to a certain extent, is that everybody has an end goal that's consistent supposedly with the strategic plan. May or may not be, but everybody has an end goal that that's where they're trying to get. But the way in which they get there, and so it's tough. It's kind of tough to understand everything that's going on in an institution, unless once again you have that 10,000-foot view, and basically the only person that has that view is the chief administrator, the president, the chancellor, whoever that is, that has responsibility to sign all the checks for the entire institution. They're the only one that really has that 10,000-foot view. Everybody else is a little bit lower altitude, if not right on the ground. And so it's a little difficult to explain why we were doing a certain thing if the explanation is that big 10,000-foot explanation, and the person that you're trying to explain to is on the ground, and why this is why you have to do this, and this is why we're going to be doing this, and this is why we're going to be doing this. And so you've seen these in the old military movies, where they're planning the big thing and they have the board there and they're moving all the pieces around and they're talking about the old World War II movies or World War I movies. There's a bit of that takes place, because you do have to that whole notion of loose coupling. We don't talk too much about the coupling. The coupling is really kind of, you might think of that as like rubber bands or elastic bands. And so when you move one thing, it pulls a lot of other things in different directions. And so there's no decision that only has an impact on one unit or one group within one unit. They have an impact on the entire structure. And so, once again, the question is, how loose do we couple these things? I mean, how tightly do we tighten the rubber bands, or how much play do we put in them?
One of the things with the loose coupling piece, because that is the topic I chose for my paper, one of the things that helped me kind of look at it was to pull up the org chart for the institution I'm writing about. And one of the examples I gave was talking about the College of Education was creating a learning community for people who wanted to potentially go into education majors as they came in for their freshman and sophomore years. So when I started looking at the org chart for that and looking at the pieces that were involved, we had academic affairs and student affairs. There were so many different lines involved between the collaboration at the College of Education level, and then you had to get housing involved, and then you had human resources involved because it required staffing. And so looking at what the impact of just that one program would be and the impact across the various paths down the org chart seemed to kind of help make that make sense to me a little more.
Yeah, it can. I mean, because you know, ultimately somebody has to be coordinating that notion. And you'd always like coordination to be as low as possible in the organizational structure. You know, the closer it is to the ground, the better the coordination can be typically. But you know, it also needs to be somebody that has the, you know, the authority to be able to make decisions that impact different units.
Yeah.
And that's once again, and what I'm trying to kind of remind you of throughout this course is that there's always, whether it's the structure and creativity thing or the, you know, freedom and control or whatever it is, there's always a tension. There's always a trade-off. And so everything that you do involves some level of trade-off someplace else. Because the organization is not infinitely rich, and it doesn't have infinite resources, and it's always, you know, if resources get pulled one way, they get pulled away from another way. So if you set priorities as an institution, we're going to prioritize these three things, that automatically means you're going to deprioritize something else, because it's all innately, you know, bound up together, and you can't really go one direction without impacting another direction.
So it's loosely coupled, not a system of per se of operations, because it can go on that spectrum.
Can be, yeah.
That's how I interpret it. So I went with that, and it makes sense. But is it more as a hierarchical organizational chart type function?
You can actually apply it to both, because you can take a look at a organizational structure, a chart, whatever, and the loosely coupled component really has to do with how much how the decisions are made within and across those organizational structures. I mean, do the decisions tend to be made autonomously within one silo or one, you know, pipeline, one column, or are they made across and then, you know, kind of filter down? When I was at the community college, I was one of 4 senior administrators. There was the president, the VP for for academics and student affairs, the VP for operations and budgets, and the director of institutional effectiveness. And we met weekly. You know, first thing Monday morning, we'd have a 2 or 3 hour meeting, and we would kind of look at, you know, the state of the institution, so to speak, you know, as much as it could have changed in a week or 2 weeks or whatever. And, you know, I would meet with the president on Friday and get some notion about his concerns Friday morning. And then I'd spend Friday, you know, pulling data and running data and, you know, doing analysis, things like that. And so, you know, kind of generating a 2-pager, you know, kind of a 2-page report thing that on Monday morning we could use to frame the discussion. And, you know, I would always offer my suggestions too. I would, you know, in my 2-pager, I'd say, suggesting to do the following thing. But you know, the group in and of itself, the 4 of us would meet, and we'd go through all that, and we'd kick it around a little bit and debate it a little bit and talk about it a little bit. And then, you know, people would start kind of leaving the mix. I would be the first out. The operations guy would be the second out. And so left in the room was the president and the VP for academic affairs and student services. And then those 2 would make the decision. Now, did I like the structure? Yeah, not so much, because you always want to be in the room when the final decision is made. But I knew, this was the way this institution had run. And so, the hierarchy and the structure was very well known. And so it wasn't like, it was a surprise to me when I took that job that, that was going to be the way things happened. But, it eventually left to why was part of the reason I left. But at the same time, it was the structure. And so, that's, maybe we'd decide we needed more input from deans and things like that. If we did, we did. If we didn't, we didn't. But, we had considered the impact on based on the data we had, based on, the things going on in student affairs and academic affairs, based on operational budgets and things like that. And then, the president ultimately would make a decision. But the last two people in the room would be the VP for Academic Affairs and Student Services and the president. And they would be making the decisions. And so, the decision process, we talk a lot about collaborative decision making and, those sorts of elements and structures and all. And that's primarily to seek input and to provide information. Like, you want people in your organization to know what you're talking about, to kind of know what we need to make a decision about. You want to get their input as much as you can. But then at some point, the discussion has to stop, and then the decision percolates up. But ultimately, the decision is made by the one guy or one gal, whoever. Whoever's sitting in that, the one big office you have in a small institution, they're the ones that, have to make, ultimately have to make that decision. And, in my 40 years, I've not seen much difference between male administrators and female administrators in that regard. Because ultimately, somebody has to make a decision. Because they're the one that signs all the checks. They have the ultimate responsibility. They're the one that gets arrested for fraud and, theft and things like that. So yeah, they worry about all that stuff. So there is, the organizations have to function, and each one, as we talked about earlier, each one based on its characteristics and, what its goal, what its purpose is, has to function in a certain way. And once you kind of get that structure and understand that structure, then you can begin to understand a lot of the ways in which decisions are made and a lot of the ways in which organizations either succeed or fail as they go along. Other thoughts about that, the structural elements of it. Because now we kind of begin to talk more about the environment that's created. Whether it's the decision-making environment, the feel of the campus, the feel of the institution, the impact on individuals. Is it an oppressive environment? Is it a permissive environment? What sort of environment do we have? And so the in particular, the Ruscio reading that is in the block for this week, which I assume you probably may or may not read yet, is on organized anarchy. Is kind of an expression of looking at what are the elements of the environment that make a place good to work or bad to work. I mean, if you were to say, without maybe having read all this shit, if you were to say, what are the things that make you want to work someplace? in academia? I mean, what are the one-liners? What are the characteristics? What are the words that describe that place?
I think it definitely has to be a culture that is interested in taking the perspectives of many. And for me personally, I enjoy working somewhere where you really are aligning what you're doing each and every day to the mission and the vision of the school. And I also want to be somewhere where there's strong leadership that doesn't change with the wind or change with the wave.
Yeah.
Before, when you were describing the leadership team, that's actually pretty much my organization, and I'm part of that small decision-making team. When you were talking about left with 2 in the room, I was actually in that almost exact position today, because we have a big meeting coming up tomorrow. And you know, so often I see the tension of you take the perspectives, but you take them, but you leave them. Or they just kind of come to here, and it would be, and I think that goes to the leadership. So for me, the tension I feel is when we're chasing and staying instead of staying true to our mission. So culture, I've seen good and bad culture, and it's just very frustrating if you're someone that really wants to, you know, go with the mission and the vision. And I'm a visionary type of person, so I'm thinking, that's really not going to be a good decision down there. I'm that 10,000 feet girl. I don't like the nitty gritty. That's someone else I want them to do that part.
Yeah. Well,
So that's my strength or whatever. So I understand, like you just described my environment a few minutes ago, and then a couple other people did too. I was thinking, wow, yeah.
Yeah, and unless you've actually, and I'm not saying this in any sort of pejorative way or anything, unless you've actually been in that circumstance, you really don't have a crystal clear notion. I mean, what always gets to me, and I used to be in charge of mentoring new administrators to a certain extent because I had been in several roles, administrative roles, and I'd kind of worked my way out of all of those because it just wasn't what I wanted to do for the next 25 years or so. And so I kept going back to the classroom, or kept getting into, other things like university assessment models and stuff like that. But I used to be assigned the responsibility of mentoring a lot of new administrators. And I always told them, there's some things that you can't anticipate. There's some things you can only experience. And once you experience it, then you'll know what that feels like, but you'll also know why you had to do what you had to do. I mean, what was it that led you to that moment, or to that decision? I mean, because you can't, there's a policy manual and a handbook, and the strategic plan, and what the mission and vision is, mission and vision is, and all those things, and yet you're kind of looking at the circumstances that you are looking at, and if they don't fit, they don't fit, and you're having to make decisions about people's lives and their livelihoods and futures and things like that. If we cut this thing over here, there are 10 people go with it. Now we can reassign a couple of them, 2 or 3 of them, but there's a few people who are just going to go away because we can't do this over here and do this over here. And, you know, I've seen a lot of administrators kind of go slowly nuts, trying to, you know, deal with the sort of the morality of those decisions. And can't dwell. You really can't dwell. You have to keep a focus. Now, if you think the mission and vision is wrong, then okay, let's press to change that. Let's look at the strategic model here, the strategic direction we're going, and let's have that discussion. And then if we change that discussion, then we're going another way. You know, App State's been going through that for a while, because, you know, they decided the big thing in higher ed these days is to be place-based, to have institutions that are within the region of the territory that they exist in, and to attempt to have, you know, some focus or some structure around that geography and around the culture within that geography. Well, App's down here in the middle of the mountains. And we've got students that may be rich kids from Charlotte or Greensboro or wherever, but we're down here in the mountains, and we're surrounded by abject poverty in these mountains. And we're surrounded by poor healthcare services. And we're surrounded by, you know, students and cultures that have been abused for hundreds of years. And so the university has taken on some of those missions, and some of those missions, like in the new College of Health, part of their focus is, you know, providing healthcare to populations that are underserved and, you know, have, you know, traditional distrust of doctors and distrust of, you know, medicine and science and all that. And at the same time, you know, take on the mission of providing stronger educational services for, you know, underserved populations and all that. And so as you do that, that pulls away from other elements. And then when you couple with that the notion of sustainability, and, you know, App State's quickly becoming a fully sustainable campus. I mean, we're well on that mission now. And so if you add all those things together, you kind of get a vision of what the institution wants to be 5 years from now or 10 years from now. And some of the things we're doing now don't fit. So we're constantly going through this kind of restructuring idea. And, you know, we seem to have pretty well cleared house of all senior academic administrators. And now we're, you know, kind of thinking about how that's going to take us, and it's going to take us in a different direction. We've become much more focused around gender issues. We've become much more focused around, you know, poverty issues, things like that. And so it's a different institution. And we'll see, you know, how we sort all that out. And that's what we're doing now. We're sorting it out. But you have to have an understanding of what that view is Heidi says, what that view is from 10,000 feet. But you also have to have an idea what that view is from 500 feet or what that view is on the ground. And you couple that with all the stuff that goes on every day, you know, and in an administrative role in higher ed, every day is, you know, multiple forest fires to be put out. And you just have to figure which one's going to burn you first. Because, you know, if you don't deal with them, they'll all burn you. It's just, you know, which one do you deal with first? And, you know, I'm amazed at administrators, you know, presidents and chancellors that can last 25 or 30 years, you know, doing that, because they, you know, it has, in my limited experience of having to fill in and do some of that time, it can drive you nuts if you're not careful. And so that's what I mean by not carrying the morality of every decision you make around with you. It's just like a teacher coming home at night and carrying the burden of all their students home at night. You can't do that. You have to find, how do you leave stuff at the door and what do you not leave at the door and that sort of stuff. But it's a fascinating sort of environment to work in, but it's horribly frustrating.
I was going to add too that your fires are not only external, they're internal. And most of the time you have both internal and external fires happening at the same time. Today there was an external fire, and, from my perspective is, people want to bring you into these fires to help them. They're looking for you to mentor them. They're looking for you to guide them. And I do actually mentor administrators and faculty members. But one of the things I've learned from my administration currently is my boss is a very fast processor, whereas she'll just make these decisions so quick. I'm like, whoa. Whereas I will take more time. I'm a little bit more methodical about it, and need to think through it a little bit. But it has been neat to see how different administrators process information, and really learning how to just leave it at the door. And I think that's something that you get better with over time. But anyway, I was just kind of touching on some of the things that you just said, that because I see them very true. Even though I'm not in higher education, I'm in a K-12 institution right now. I see the same type of thing in my institution.
I had a president that I worked for, an amazing man that I worked for 20 plus years, 25 years. And Dr. Carrier, he and I got to be pretty good friends. We were, social friends too. I mean, we could sit around, and have a nice dinner and a couple of drinks and, talk to each other and lay things out and all. We always left at the door. When you got the institution, you had your different responsibilities, different roles. But one night he may have had maybe one too many. I don't know. We were talking, and he was so frustrated with trying to get the traditional academic faculty to sign off on a new college that was going to be an integrated science college. And so the physics guys didn't like it, and the math guys didn't like it, and the chemistry guys didn't like it, and but basically nobody liked it. But he could see kind of where the future was at. He knew that was the future. As it turned out, it certainly was. But he said, I hate working around PhDs and smart people. He said, it's just, university faculty are just like kindergartners with PhDs, in that they have the same motivations as little kids, and that they all want to play just in their spot and play just the game they want to play and do what they want to do. And that's why we hire them. He said, that's why we hire them, because you want people to be experts in what they're experts in. You want to be the best they are. You're going to hire a physicist. You want them to be the best you can afford. But he says, as a result of that, you get, people that are very mindful of their own interests and their own academic interests and things like that. And so you just call them, kindergartners with PhDs. He didn't share that with the faculty. He shared that to me several times. It was kind of one of our little private jokes. But, that was his biggest deal, because he was one of those visionaries. He was one of those guys that could, go to a conference or read a few research articles or, a couple magazines, or talk to people that were kind of futurist oriented. And he'd come back and he'd say, that's what we need to do. let's do that. Let's figure out how to do that. It used to be a joke going around that on 4 o'clock Friday afternoon, he would have these staff meetings. That was like senior academic staff. It was like department heads and deans and, you know, bureau chiefs and things like that. People that were, you know, in the upper levels of the administration. And I'd been there long enough that I understood exactly what was happening. When we had one of those 4 o'clock meetings, we had a couple of them a year or maybe 3 or 4 a year. There was something coming because you never had more than a couple weeks notice. And he was going to announce something new, and you were going to have a plan together by Monday morning of how we're going to get there. And so we'd have a Friday afternoon, 4 o'clock, and people would ask, well, what's going to happen? What are we going to do? I said, well, just bring your notepad and your tape recorder, because he's going to announce something and you're going to have to figure out how we're going to do it by Monday morning, because he'll want a plan next week. And sure enough, that's exactly what would happen every time. And they were all good. They're all good ideas. They're great ideas. And you kind of looked at each other and said, well, how come we didn't think of that before? Why didn't that come to us before? And that was because he was that kind of visionary. You know, you have those individuals that can kind of see where things need to go. And they get bored at trying to figure out how to get there. They leave that up to other people. But they're pretty spot on in terms of what we need to do. It's just a matter of how do we get there. Yeah. And you only get to experience those folks about once in your career, maybe. And when you do, everybody else kind of looks a little bit pale in comparison. But I was fortunate enough, I got to experience 20 years with that guy, 20 plus years. And he was that guy. He was that visionary. But you know, it ate him up. He all developed, you know, all kind of the self-destructive habits that people like that tend to develop over the years. And yeah, so retired too early or got pushed out too early and died too early, and you know, all those things. But while his flame was bright, it was very bright. And you just get to encounter those folks once upon a time, and then they burn out and they go away. And you know, that was interesting, but you know, it probably colored a lot of these things that I'm talking about in terms of organizations, because I saw him operating, and I saw how other people operated around him. And you know, everybody, I can't think of a single person that worked with him a lot that didn't have an absolute uncompromised respect for him. Now, they may not like him, but they understood the genius, they understood the vision. And yeah, that was enough. All right, I'm sorry, Golf, on that. I get kind of reminisce about him because, as I say, you don't encounter those guys too often. And he was one of those. I guess the next step is to let me, you know, this revised analysis is due by tomorrow night. If you need a couple more days to do that, please do so, but just get it to me by Thursday or so that I can get through those before we meet next Monday, and then we can kind of put a little bit of a frame around, you know, what you had said there, and kind of, you know, top that off and kind of move on. I'll put up the additional readings for next week. We're beginning to think about this sort of organized anarchy idea, this notion of you know, some political perspectives that form around institutions that create cultural elements within an institution or cultural environments. And then after spring break, we will completely shift focus into looking at how institutions impact the people that work within them. The term that Morgan likes to use called psychic prisons. Institutions can become psychic prisons, and what are the elements of them that become psychic prisons. And we'll back off the second group thing. I said at least for a week. So that was going to be due on the 15th. It'll be no earlier than 22nd. It might even bleed into the following week. And then I'll try to get that schedule stuff sorted out in the morning and get these other readings opened up in the morning, so you'll have those to kind of work with. Yeah. And then we'll kind of go from there next week, see where we're headed. I know that unfortunately you're experiencing me in one of my semesters of structural limitations. I was assigned a new role, and we didn't know quite what the role was going to look like. And I feel that I need to do the best job I can with it, because not that I want that job, but because we want to justify the existence of the job. But it's someone to serve as a general mentor to doctoral students. And that's kind of where I'm going.
Here's something I found on the web. According to utexas.edu, when I get where I'm going.
What's going on here? Okay. All right. Okay. Well, that makes it interesting. Okay. I can't do anything about that. So we're getting ready to kind of wrap this thing up anyhow. So we'll kind of take this as a sign. It's a cosmic sign. It's time for me to shut this thing down. Let's see, how can I get out of this? Bingo. All right, we're back. So anyway, any thoughts, any questions, any comments? We'll try to do a bit more substantive discussion next week once we get your ideas on this. I think we've had a pretty good discussion this week. I think there are, if there are elements of this that you want to spend a bit more time with, or you want to, talk about in more detail or whatever, please bring it up, because it's really kind of a shared experience sort of thing, and there are lots of things that you can only get from experience, and sort of that shared experience piece I think is very important in preparing people to think about roles, going into roles like this. Okay, we're good. Do some reading, and if you haven't done that little 4 or 5 pager, take another couple of days, and there's a link to submit it, and then I'll have a little constructive reading to do by the weekend. I'll be out of town Thursday and Friday, but I'll be reading Friday night. So, all right, folks. Have a good evening, and we will see you same time, same place next week, and go from there. All right. Good evening.
Good night, all.